Hello, American History 2. Welcome back to our second topic in this exciting online week of online education. Now, if you're viewing this, you should have already gone over my lecture on the countercultural movement of the 1960s and the early 1970s. Today, we're going to look at the other side of the coin and look at the start of the Conservative Counterrevolution that helped to push back and to sort of downplay some of the either successes or the terrors, I suppose, depending on your point of view, of the countercultural movement. Now, as I'm sure many of you know, we typically associate Ronald Reagan with a major part of the conservative sort of reconsurgence in the country. But today we're going to talk about President Nixon especially and some other issues that helped lead to President Reagan's election and the eventual triumph, you could call it, of more conservative politics and values in the 1980s. Now, to get into that, of course, we're going to look at the key terms first. We'll look at the Altamont Speedway Free Festival. We'll look at the infamous Watergate scandal. We'll look at an organization called WIN. We'll look at the oil crisis, and we'll look at the Iran hostage crisis. Again, I'll just spend a little bit of time on this since I already talked about it in the last video. We do, of course, have some upcoming dates. If you have any questions about these assignments, where to find them, how to turn them in, or anything along those lines, please do let me know as soon as possible. But in the meantime, we'll go ahead and jump right into the whole situation for today. Now, the counterculture is believed to have declined in America, according to historians, for three important reasons. First, you have the success of its major movements. As I mentioned, second wave feminism and the sexual revolution, and as we've already talked about, the civil rights movement, had many successes throughout this time period. Why might that actually lead to a decline in these movements, though? Very good. Once again, imaginary class back at home. Many people felt that there really wasn't anything to fight for anymore. As I'm sure all of you know, if you have any sort of news or internet connection, all of those issues are still hotly debated today. But for a while during this time period, when it seemed like there were so many successes happening for these movements, people started to taper off when they really felt there was no controversy or anything to fight for anymore. Also, the agings and failings of the hippie generation were believed to have led to the decline of this movement. We'll talk about that especially with the Altamont Speedway Free Festival in just a second. Third, you also have the overall decline of the economy. For those of you who were paying attention last time, why might the decline of the economy lead to a decline in the counterculture movement? Very good. Once again, listeners at home, if you remember, a big reason the counterculture was able to happen in the first place is people had enough prosperity to be able to go out and educate themselves or devote all of their time to these various counterculture movements. Once the economy started to decline, people didn't have either the prosperity or the courage to be willing to participate in organizations like this, and were essentially just more concerned in towing the line and making sure they could feed themselves and gain employment. All of those super crucial things. But anyway, one of the major events that seem to have led to the decline and credibility of the countercultural movement is the Altamont Speedway Free Festival on December 6, 1969, which you can see pictured right here. By the way, December 6th is actually my birthday. So yes, it's my birthday in just a few weeks. Go me. But this is one of the more less than pleasant incidents that's ever happened on my birthday. So if I ever go to look at famous events on my birthday, I like to skip over this one. Essentially, this was a counterculture movement that was held in Altamont to mirror the success of Woodstock. They saw how successful Woodstock was. They wanted to replicate that. Unfortunately, however, they hired, as you can see here, Hell's Angels to be some of their security guards. They reportedly became drunk and violent throughout the concert, according to various witnesses. During the concert, Meredith Curley Hunter Jr., who was an 18-year-old African-American male, was killed by the Hells Angels after he reportedly approached the stage with the revolver. Along with the previously mentioned drug issues involved in the concert as well, this helped to disillusion the countercultural movement among many people. Now, why, and again, this can connect a little bit to modern day issues as well, why might this in particular help to discredit and disillusion the counterculture movement? Oh yeah, this one's probably pretty obvious because again, it's very similar with issues we still have to deal with today. Not only was this a young individual being killed during this concert, but it's an African American male, which a big part of the countercultural movement was supposed to be supporting racial equality, but now you have African Americans being killed during your concerts. Obviously going to be a huge blow to the credibility of this movement that's meant to support racial equality. Now, Richard Nixon was actually, I'm sure a few of you are already aware of Richard Nixon and know of his less than pleasant reputation in American history. However, at the time, Richard Nixon was essentially seen to be the new hope, as I like to call him as a Star Wars reference, by many conservatives. They felt he was going to be the president who was going to help push back against a lot of the protesting and disrespect towards the government and the war effort and things like that, and help to get America back on the right track as they saw it. A couple of reasons for this that made Richard Nixon very attractive to them. First was his Vietnamization plan, also known as something he would call peace with honor. This is the plan turning over of the Vietnam War to South Vietnamese troops. This is essentially seen to be a compromise between the war and anti-war activists. So on the one hand, conservatives are getting what they want because we're still going to be supporting South Vietnam and we're not going to just leave them to North Vietnamese troops. However, anti-war activists ideally should also be pleased because Americans will no longer be risking their own lives in the war and will no longer be interjecting themselves in a foreign situation as they see it. By 1972, he had also reestablished relations with China, which led to a huge trading boost, as I'm sure you can all imagine. For example, I'd like you all to take a moment right now and look at the tags on whatever clothes or shoes you happen to be wearing right now. Go ahead, take a moment. Yeah, this is probably a point in this demonstration because this is something we all know, but I can almost pretty much guarantee that all of you had at least something on that is made from China. You can thank Richard Nixon for that. Finally, in 1973, he was able to temporarily secure a peace agreement with the North Vietnamese and was able to state to the American people that peace was at hand. He was seen as the president that was finally going to end the Vietnam War and end this huge controversy that seemed to be tearing the country apart. Now, however, like I said, most of us know that President Nixon doesn't really have a great reputation in American history. Why was he actually not successful long term? Very good. Class, once again, watching at home. That would, of course, be a result of the Watergate scandal. Dun, dun, dun. The Watergate scandal, just to give a very brief rundown, took place on June the 17th, 1972. Several men were arrested for attempting to break into the Democratic National Convention's headquarters at the Watergate Hotel, hence the name of the Watergate scandal. Now, the reason this is so significant is that many of these individuals were found to be former CIA members. They were also eventually discovered to have possessed money from Nixon's re-election committee, and the FBI director eventually admitted to destroying related documents to the Watergate scandal. One of the most important events of this scandal was the Nixon office tapes, which took place on July 13, 1973. On this day, under questioning, White House assistant Alexander Butterfield admitted that conversations were being taped in the Oval Office. If you have proof that a scandal took place, it would obviously be pretty upsetting for the defendant to know that they had office tapes that could record everything that had occurred. By July 24th of 1974, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the tapes had to be turned over to the prosecution as evidence for their case. The tapes would eventually reveal Nixon's knowledge of a cover-up attempt, including giving out hush money to individuals. The House of Representatives eventually brought articles of impeachment against Nixon on the charge of abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and contempt for Congress. By August 9th, he had resigned, and his vice president, Gerald Ford, had now become president. So again, that was just a very brief outline of the Watergate scandal and what occurred. The major thing I want you to focus on for now is one of the major characteristics of President Nixon's defense. During his defense, his lawyer's main case was the right to executive privilege. Executive privilege is defined as the right of the executive branch, and therefore, of course, by extension, the president, to keep communications confidential and resist subpoenas and oversight under certain circumstances. So essentially, Nixon and his defenders claimed that because of executive privilege, he did not have to turn over these tapes to the federal government and to prosecutors. This raised a question at this time that is still debated to this day. What are these certain circumstances? Well, first, what are these certain circumstances that would allow for a president to claim executive privilege? As I say here again, stroking my beard like a Bond villain. But yeah, I'm sure many of you could probably figure this out. National security is typically given as the main reason for executive privilege. As you might have learned in another American history class or civics class, for example, the president is considered to be our chief diplomat and also is considered to be the commander-in-chief of our armed forces. Therefore, it is true that the executive branch does probably deal in communications and issues that you wouldn't want the general public, and more importantly, by extension, the rest of the world to know everything about. So this is typically when cases of executive privilege are brought up, when the president would arguably reveal something that could threaten national security. However, as you can see here, is executive privilege a good thing? Yes, I won't give you too much of a pause on this one because this one, again, is of course a bit up to opinion. Many people, especially very pro-military individuals, would probably very clearly argue that executive privilege can protect national security. Because again, since America is so heavily involved in security and issues around the world, there are issues you probably wouldn't want everyone else to know about. However, other people who don't like executive privilege would point to instances of when Nixon used this seemingly just to defend himself from investigations that had nothing to do with real national security issues. Now, as some of you may know, executive privilege is still a very large issue. For example, in the past couple of years, President Donald Trump has argued that his office should be immune to certain investigations because of executive privilege, and has used executive privilege as a reason to deny releasing his tax returns to the public on a few occasions. Now, once again, don't worry. I'm not going to get too much into my political opinions on that, but it does show that this executive privilege issue is, again, nothing new. It's something that the public and our government has had to debate over for many decades at the very least. So again, even many of the issues we have with Donald Trump and Donald Trump's presidency are nothing new. But anyway, to go into some of the post-Nixon years and the pre-Reagan years, we'll look at some of the years of the Ford and Carter presidencies. These were also considered by many historians to be years that gave another opening to the later, more prominent conservative counterrevolution due to the economic and international struggles our country went through after Nixon left office. For example, you had the infamous Inflation and Win campaign of the Ford presidency. In this campaign, to combat inflation that was going on across the country, Gerald Ford started a voluntary campaign based on stickers which read, "Win, whip inflation now." This was meant to solve inflation through public inaction instead of government involvement. So essentially, the government was urging the public to take responsibility of inflation themselves by carpooling to reduce gas use, growing their own vegetable gardens, and turning down the thermostat. As you might imagine, this was not very popular with many people in the American public who didn't like the idea of being blamed for inflation that they felt they really had no control over and what they saw as government inaction. This was later described by members of the Ford administration as the biggest government public relations blunder ever. Hugely unpopular campaign. One of those individuals to protest this campaign would be to wear the buttons upside down, explaining that NIM stood for No Immediate Miracles, Non-Stop Inflation Merry-Go-Round, or Need Immediate Money. So again, very fun and creative counter-protesting, I think. This was made worse by the 1973 oil crisis, when the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, mainly halted their oil exports to America in protest of their support of Israel in the October War. I won't get into too much detail about the October War, but as you might imagine, many of these Arabic countries didn't like the idea that we were supporting Israel in what they saw as their rightful territory. So obviously it led to a huge conflict that led to oil prices going up, increasing inflation even more than it already had been. This all seemed to come to a head during the presidency of Jimmy Carter, where he gave his infamous Crisis of Confidence speech on July 15, 1979. The speech was intended to help solve the energy crisis by coming up with alternatives for Americans to avoid having to rely upon these Arabic countries for oil. However, the main reason this speech is remembered is because of, again, this crisis of confidence idea. During the speech, he said at one point, all the legislation in the world can't fix what's wrong with America. What is lacking is confidence and a sense of community. Now, why do you think that might be so unpopular with Americans across the world? Very good. Once again, this is essentially a similar criticism that the Win campaign faced. Many people felt during this time that the government was essentially letting them down and was blaming the problems of America on the people instead of taking its own responsibility. So many people felt that instead of actually giving any solutions that could help stop this energy crisis, Carter was just blaming the American people for it and claiming this was all happening because they didn't have enough confidence and community to help fix the problem. So again, this led to a lack of confidence and a lack of support for the Carter administration, which got even worse with the infamous Iranian hostage crisis. Now, I think we might have talked about this a little bit briefly earlier in the semester, but just for a bit of background, as some of you may already know, America had actually supported the Iranian government in the Iranian Revolution. However, the Iranian Revolution was successful in the 1970s, and an Islamic government took over. In 1979, Carter allowed the exiled Iranian Shah of Iran to come over to America for cancer treatment after he'd been defeated in the revolution. In response to this, the Iranian mob seized the American embassy in Tehran and took 53 Americans hostage. This crisis lasted over a year and resulted in a failed rescue attempt. 8 were killed when a combat helicopter and a transport plane crashed, going to try to free the hostages. Perhaps as an even greater insult, the hostages were only released when Carter was defeated in the election of 1980. Now, why is this going to reflect so poorly on Carter's presidency? Very good. Once again, students hopefully watching this at home, this is essentially seen as a failure of Carter's commander-in-chief responsibilities. So many of his opponents argued that not only was he trying to blame the American people for not having enough confidence to fix their problems, they would now be able to argue that when he had to face a tough situation, he didn't have the confidence or the skill necessary to try to handle the situation. So again, very unpopular move on the Carter administration's part, which helped to leave the door open when Carter lost his re-election campaign for President Reagan to take power in the executive branch and to help really usher in the Conservative Counterrevolution we're all a bit more familiar with. But anyway, as you might guess, that's about all I have for you today. Just remember all of your upcoming assignments, and again, please let me know if you have any questions. Have a great rest of your week.